I am so excited to have Dr. Carla Espana y Dr. Luis Yadira Herrera on the podcast to talk about their book, En Comunidad, Lessons for Centering the Voices and Experiences of Bilingual Latinx Students from Heinemann Books. Dr. España, Dr. Herrera, welcome, bienvenido al podcast.
Gracias. Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you so much, Tan.
Can you start us off with telling us about how you spend your days and where you spend your days now?
Ooh, I'll
Go
start
for it.
with
Yes.
my life has changed drastically. I have a toddler, so my days have changed. Like my life has changed. But I am currently the assistant professor of bilingual education and Puerto Rican, Latinx, and Latin American studies at Brooklyn College in the City University of New York. So some days I will spend a lot of time preparing for my classes. I teach. I spend time in my meetings, and I'll have now my committees I'm a part of. And also because I'm a mom and my toddler just started school, I'm spending a lot of time in New York City commuting, as you hear in the background, our commuting, background soundtrack. So I spend a lot of time now commuting and navigating the that calendar that is being a parent and getting a child to school. So that's new to me. And other than that, I love spending time with my family. We're in an intergenerational home, and so we spend with my parents, a lot of storytelling in Spanish, stories from Chile, where we're from. And my husband's family is from Colombia. So we have a lot of those moments together. So those are some of my days. A little bit of teaching. We do some writing. Eventually, I have 2 research studies for the spring. And a lot of days I spend here on the Zoom with Luz, and we're writing together. And so a lot of writing is happening in presentations. Pero Luz, does that sound, what is it like for you?
Yeah, so for me, I mean, a lot of the same, right? Of course, I'm an assistant professor of bilingual education at California State University, Channel Islands, and I live in Los Angeles. So during the week, I spend time planning for my classes, of course, committee meetings, teaching, and I'm a mother as well. My son is in 3rd grade, Rami, and so there's about 2 hours of my life every single day, dedicated to school drop off and pick up pretty much. But he goes to a wonderful bilingual school, and I'm really happy that he's there. Other than that, I spend time with my family. My family, they're all in LA, and they live 5-7 minute drive away from here. So I spend a lot of time with them or playing tennis. That's what I do for fun. Of course, hanging out with my friends or going out, having some fun too.
You both talked about raising your children in a bilingual family, intergenerational family. So, what does your children's room look like according to books?
I can start, and Carla was, telling you a little bit about that off camera. But so Remy, his dad is Nigerian, and obviously I'm not obviously, but I'm Mexican, and so we speak Spanish and English at home. He's also learning Yoruba uh, on Zoom with teachers from Nigeria, actually on the weekends, and so he's becoming trilingual. But his books, he's got a lot of picture books, and now he's growing his library of, like Carla mentioned, the early readers and the chapter books that we read together still. And so he's got a lot to choose from. So thankfully, like, I don't think he'll probably in a very long time, he won't run out of anything to read for a very long time. Thankfully, I'm so fortunate to have, to be able to provide all of what I can provide for my child, because, well, number one, of course, I have so many resources as a bilingual educator, but also publishers have sent us books, and they also make their way to Remy's library, right? But of course, I've invested over the years and gifts and all of that. So lots of books, lots of art, like affirming messages. There's a pillow in his bed that says "You matter," and for me, it's really important to support his bilingual, Black biracial identity.
And Luz, is that the You Matter from the Christian Robinson collection?
Yes, it's a Christian Robinson collection, which I love.
Shout out. We love that collection because Christian Robinson is one of our favorite illustrators, children's book illustrators. So we have all all of Christian Robinson's books and also trying to get all the other products. So I do remember that pillow. It's so beautiful. I hope to get, those are my goals. So Luz's child's room are my goals for the future. My child is turning 3 soon. So that room we have set up like a little 2 displays for books, and one is just on the lower, like more her height, so she can grab and go. For now, there's just a lot of picture books there. There's a basket with board books, the little libros that are the bilingual books are in the basket because they're just easy to flip through. I love collecting some of the books by Julie Flett, and so I love having Indigenous representation too in different languages. So I have some books too that are by other authors and illustrators that are in Plains Cree and English. I love Tracy Sorrell's books in Cherokee and English. And I think that's also important. So not only that I have books in Spanish and English, but I also want my child to grow up to see that there are so many other languages too. But for now, anything that has animals, trucks, any vehicles, those are my child's favorites. Any vehicles and animal books are right now trending in our house.
The reason I asked for that question, there wasn't a question that I wrote to you because it just seemed quite natural to ask. The reason is because we have to be intentional about raising our children in bilingual families. And my family wasn't intentional as both you are, so we didn't read Vietnamese books. And so I can speak Vietnamese and I can hear Vietnamese and I can barely read some Vietnamese words, but your children are having such different experiences because of your research that you understand that like intentionality has to be the center of bilingual families. And how do we do that? We read with them. We talk to them in different languages, and we have them translanguage between and filling their rooms and their experiences from a young age with books, with lots of representation and in different languages.
Yeah, so beautiful. And I love that we listen a lot to the canticos, on Nick Jr. canticos that are Spanish English songs. There's these little pollitos that te cantan en español y después al final de la canción dice otra vez, again in English. And so the same song you have in a Spanish verse and you have in English. So we'll be walking in the street with my child and we're singing a song in Spanish, and then next thing you know, she says again, and I gotta sing it in English. So my song list has expanded in the last 3 years with this child.
Can you please share with us a story about teaching that has influenced your practice to this day?
I can start.
Yeah,
because I have a visual representation of that story sitting on my desk every day. I see it when I sit to write and do my work. When I was a first-year teacher, I was following the script of what I was told, would be great lessons for the first few days. And I had the students a second day of school. The day before, I had assigned homework to bring a special object. And this is in a 6th grade bilingual classroom. Most of my students were from Dominican Republic. Some were from Mexico, but for the most part in the neighborhood I was at, it was mostly those from Dominican Republic. And I gave them options: bring something that's a special object or a picture that's meaningful to you so you can write a story about the people or that moment that picture is reminding you of, or that the object reminds you of something special. So the next day I'm getting ready to teach, and this is like, I'm a first-year teacher, and all the kids are excited. Almost everybody has pictures and they're all talking about their pictures. I'm like, yeah, this is great. And then I hear a lot of chatter in one group. And I go up to this group and I see the student who I had heard that was like gonna give me a little trouble, because it was a student who was very, wanted to be funny. And I was like, oh, here we go. So I had these assumptions about this kid already, right? I came with a narrative about this child. And they have this, everyone's talking about pictures around them, but they're all talking to him and he doesn't have a picture. And I said, where's your picture? Where's your picture? Everyone has a picture. Where's your picture? And he said, no, profe, or Miss Espana, profe, you said we can bring, an object or picture, and this is my object. And I said, well, they're just laughing. Are you taking this seriously? And I got all judgmental. It was a rock. And he tells me, well, it's a rock from the Dominican Republic. And I brought it because it reminds me of, I used to go to the river with my cousins and play. And here in New York City, moving here, I haven't had my family around and I don't go out much to play. And already inside, like, I just want to cry. So big lesson learned. And so everyone was very excited because they had connections to, they also were going to the river in Dominican Republic to play. And there was this innocence of like childhood, of play, and the importance of family and having those moments together. And in my busyness of like as a teacher trying to check the boxes and having these assumptions about that child already and trying to get through my lesson, I was missing that. And then that student gave me that rock. They wrote about the river. That was their narrative moment. They wrote about, I got to know more about their family, Dominican Republic, how they live in New York City now. And I've had that rock for years. So that was 2007. He gave it to me at the end of the narrative unit, and I have it on my desk. So that's a lesson to learn for my teaching life. Check your assumptions, listen to the children. That's why the book I wrote with Luz is really important on like what are the lessons we've learned from bilingual and multilingual children, and always be open to having to shift your practice because children will teach you things.
So that story is a physical manifestation of your subtitle, which is about like lessons for centering voices, right, of kids. And so if we're centering kids, we have to listen to them, and it's about developing relationships with kids.
So I think for me, the vision or the visual or the image that comes up is kind of my early on what led me to this career. And I didn't set out to be a teacher. I majored in international development studies and Portuguese because I wanted to work for like the UN and work for like an NGO or something like that, you know. And then I joined the student organization called Conciencia Libre, or Free Conscience. And we did a few things. There were groups of like, there was a subgroup that worked with working for getting workers on campus unionized. So that's what they did. And then our group, the one that I joined, we used to go to these job centers around LA where we would teach Spanish literacy and ESL to immigrant day laborers. And so, you know, after Friday night, we like go all out, you know, as college students. And then Saturday night, 8 a.m., we were up and at a job center teaching English or Spanish literacy, while mostly men, every single one of them were men. They were waiting for jobs. You know, they, instead of like maybe hanging out in a hardware like store department, you know, hardware store looking for work or waiting for work, there were these job centers, and these job centers kind of made sure that they got a fair daily wage or hourly wage. And while they were waiting for work, they would come to us and we would bring them lunch and we would bring them snacks, and they'd like sit in and, you know, we'd teach them. And the things that we used to teach them were like articles, newspapers, because that's where I was at first introduced to the Paulo Freire method of popular education. And so we were like, okay, you know, G is not for, I don't know, giraffe, G is for globalization, you know what I mean? Like things like that. And I think that's when it sparked for me. That's when it sparked for me, like, this is my path. This is my path. I need to be in education. I need to be a teacher. And that's why I started my career as an ESL teacher. And I thought about like, you know, it just made everything real for me in terms of like the reasons why people move from one country to another, right? Like my own family was, of course, we're immigrants, but seeing that as a college student in a pretty privileged position at that point, right, was just life-changing. And it just, for me, revealed the power of education, and also a meaningful education that's contextualized, right, and connected to like people's life experiences. So that's what comes up for me.
So everything has a reason, like what you volunteered for that, and it has led you to here. So, and we're grateful that your paths, both of your paths, have led you to here, where we can learn from your book. Speaking of your book, let's talk more specifically about it. What was the seed for this book? Every book has a seed. What was the seed for En Comunidad?
Ophelia was the seed. I feel like, Carla, do you want to get us started on that?
The week that Luz and I defended our dissertations, we were at the Graduate Center in New York City, and it was where we had spent 7 years of our life in reading, writing, research in this field of the program was urban education, but we were both specializing in bilingual education. And our advisor was Ofelia Garcia, the great Ofelia Garcia in our field. And so Ofelia had read our work like for 7 years and all our courses and our dissertations. So the week that we both defended, we went out for lunch, all three of us, to celebrate. And this was in April in 2017. And at that lunch, Ofelia Garcia said, "You should write together." And at that point, we've just been, anyone who's in a graduate program, so all of you listeners and those who are viewing know that you were just trying to finish your day and move on and make it through the day and go to the next day. So it's rare that you have time to connect with others and think beyond your graduation or program or dissertation. You're just like, I need to finish. Like, how can I get to the finish line? Because I'm about to pass out. At least that was my experience every day. I felt like I'm going to pass out. And so up to that point, we hadn't thought about that together. And so our professor advisor, Ofelia Garcia, was the seed of the start of the book. And that summer, we spent time together writing, drafting the table of contents. And by that fall, I had the chapter 1 and 2. So we were ready. We were ready to put our experiences and research together and get it out there.
Now, if you could have a gardener who planted the first seed, now that would be the gardener, Ofelia Garcia, to inspire you to do that. And so, and look at how that seed has grown into your book. Let's talk about it actually more specifically. Let's talk about chapter 1, which is about centering the voices and experiences of bilingual Latinx. What did you mean by that title in that chapter?
Man, that's a really long title. I have to go back and read it to make sure I'm reading all of it. But well, we didn't come up with the title, right? The title wasn't finalized until the work was done. We had so many different sort of variations of it, and that's what the publisher finally was able to get on board with. I mean, they were totally supportive along the way, but we just thought about the essence of the book, who is this about, or who is this for, and our purpose, right, is for our kids. And so the focus has to be about how to amplify, their experiences, their voices, language and cultural practices, and all of what we do has to facilitate around that effort.
And I say that also to add, thanks, Luz, for thinking about that process. For chapter 1 specifically, when when you go for a teaching job, you're asked for a teaching philosophy, or you're in a grad program to become a teacher and you're asked to draft a teaching philosophy as an assignment for your grade for a class. That's what chapter 1 was, us processing what's the foundation of our teaching and what do we call it? If we had to narrow down the top 4 or 5 most important things foundational in our teaching of bilingual, multilingual children, what would they be? And so we went through, we had to think back on our lessons, on our unit planning curriculum that we've used, how we've modified curriculum, the results and findings of both of our first studies, our dissertation research. And that's when we said we want to talk about these principles, right? The critical bilingual literacies and those principles in chapter 1 that were guiding our teaching. So in chapter 1, you'll find that for us, at the core is this self-reflection on language ideologies, and that it's ongoing. No matter where you are, whether you're in graduate school to become a teacher, or you've been teaching for 10, 15 years, we're constantly in this self-reflection on what we think about language and language learning. And it doesn't stop. There also has to exist this unlearning, because so many of the students we've taught in our respective college teacher ed programs, or those I'm teaching now in undergrad courses, come with so much shame of languages that have been part of language minoritized communities. So whether it's Spanish or Arabic, right? Students have this legacy that's come from a lot of generations of we need to let go so we can just bring on English in this very assimilationist perspective. And that's been ingrained because of schooling and outside media representation too, right? So that's the second point that we talk about in chapter 1. It's really important to unlearn that. And then the third one is make sure that in this critical bilingual literacies approach, we're always thinking about language in relation to power. I don't care, if I'm going to teach second graders and I'm using a picture book, and how am I making sure I don't forget that? Or I'm teaching teachers in a workshop, right? And then the final one is celebration and joy. And we want to celebrate the language practices that our students are bringing, right? And so in my research study, the teacher had years and years of a journey to celebrate, because at first she was not celebrating the language practices of mostly Dominican and Mexican community. She thought they weren't as good enough as other types of Spanish that was celebrated. So it took years for that teacher to say, no, I need to celebrate these, and these are valid.
Luis, did you want to add something?
So I think really Carla really nailed it. I mean, I do want to just add, like, what part of that framework also guides how we guide our future teachers in thinking about teaching and learning, specifically through the 3 T's, what we call the 3 T's, right? So topics, text, and translanguaging, right? Which helps us have like a really sort of clear vision about how we want to move forward in our instruction. And it's been really helpful to have that framework with, and sharing these with schools and districts and other educators everywhere, because it really is about being so intentional about the topics, right? Thinking about, well, yes, we have to be able to teach in a way that honors children's language practices, but we also have to be really intentional about the topics. Like, what is it that we're teaching, the content itself, right? Like, how can we be really thoughtful about thinking of teaching of what matters, right? Like, what are the communities grappling with? How can we bring that into a classroom space to, so that children can see a way to process these together? And of course, that's the first T, right? The topics. And then the text is centered around the use of children's literature, but also multimodal text, right? Which, of course, there's so much that so many mediums, so many ways that we can learn about something in a way that's really meaningful, through podcasts, right? Through images and videos, and of course, children's books. And how can these sustain children's ideas about who they are, on their language practices? And of course, the last T is translanguaging.
Yeah, it just makes it so easy for us to remember how to put your principles that we talked about earlier, that Carla talked about, into practice with topics, text, and translanguaging. As you were talking about topic and like bringing in the topics that communities are grappling with, I can see the roots of that from your work with day laborers, and how instead of just like G is for giraffe, like G is for globalization, right? Let's move to chapter 2, actually, which is about examining language practices and identities. Actually, before I go there, I want to actually pause, because I want to ask a question that's not on the list of questions, but why do we want children to be bilingual and not just, oh, wait, they're in America, they should speak English?
Oh, man. Well, I mean, of course, multilingualism is the norm, right, globally. And it's important for us to be bilingual, multilingual, for a variety of reasons. Of course, it does help connect you to like your roots, right? For me, that's what it's done. I've been able to have this really close relationship with my family back home, and we go every year. So for me, growing up, I knew the importance of my bilingualism, right? Because I wanted to make sure to connect with my cousins who were close to my age versus my little brothers who were so far in age. So I didn't really have that sibling relationship, right? Because they were I was older than them. And so having my best friends and my cousins, that was like such a great way to keep in touch with them. We would write to each other. We would speak on the phone. And of course, just being able to travel back and forth, which is, such an important thing that I was able to do growing up. That was for me so important to just keep rooted. But also just in general, I mean, I think about the ways that we have increased access to everything, right? From the music to the art to just people to making connections across cultures. I mean, why wouldn't you choose to be? Carla, do you want to add anything? What would you like to add?
Oh, I love that. Yeah, I love that word connection. I'm thinking back to my experience. Like I said earlier, I was in a bilingual setting with mostly speakers from the Caribbean and Mexico and some from South America. And so for them, I can see like how the connection and rootedness that Luz is talking about is exactly like, yes. And even in my research, one of the lines in an interview, a sixth grader said that they were writing in Spanish and English because they wanted to help their parent with a citizenship exam in the US when they came from the Dominican Republic, or they had phone calls with a parent who was still in Dominican Republic while the child was in New York, and they would be helping their parent learn English. So there's also that like students learning for this other purpose of like helping others. So I love that. But I'm also thinking about another context for students who are, I was at a predominantly white institution for a year teaching English. But the students most of them were bilingual, multilingual, because they grew up, there were students who were speaking like different languages growing up. And so I had a lot of wonderful conversations with some of the Spanish teachers in the school, and how learning a language or teaching Spanish in that type of setting for students that Spanish wasn't a language from their home or their culture, it opened up the doors to learn about another culture and ways of being. And so for me, another reason that bilingualism and multilingualism is so beautiful is that it just makes you a more conscious and kind human being to be able to empathize with people, because you are learning not only language as something on a page, because language isn't static, language is constantly evolving, and language is contextual and connected to people. So I'm happy to have had as a teacher those experiences in very different settings to see how bilingualism and multilingualism works there.
So I'm hearing you both talk to this common quote where they say, "The limits of my world is the limits of my language." Right? And so when we don't support bilingualism, students have a connection to one world, but they lose a connection to others. And that's often the language in which is connected to their heritage and their community. Let's move to chapter 2 again. Let's talk about examining language practices and identities.
Oh, chapter 2 was so fun. I remember. So chapter 2 is where we start. So chapters 2 through 6 in the book are sequences of lessons. And in chapter 2, we start with the first sequence of lessons that helps teachers and students. So this is something teachers can engage in with students or on their own in teacher study groups, kind of unpack their own language ideologies. And so we use 2 key texts. We use Gloria Anzaldua's excerpt from Borderlands, La Frontera, the New Mestiza memoir. And it's just a short excerpt from the chapter How to Tame a Wild Tongue. And also a video clip, because we like our multimodal work, of the artist Miguel, who is a Black Mexican artist who travels in this video series to Michoacan, had never been to Mexico, to Michoacan to see family there. And so we use that video, and we use that text from the memoir of Gloria Saldúa to talk about issues of language and identity. And what does it mean when the artist says, people don't view me as like a Mexican artist, they view me as a Black artist. So what does it mean to be Black, Mexican, Spanish speaker, and why people are so limited in their view of that type of identity, right, and language speaking. So that's what chapter 2 is about, taking teachers and students through a sequence of lessons that helps them. We love the protocol in Kate Roberts and Chris Lehman's book, Energize. That was Chris' book. The Kate Roberts and Chris's book, Falling in Love with Close Reading. So they have, I know it's a corny, cheesy title. I love it. It's catchy. It'll stay with you, so I can't forget it. I love it. But in this book, they have a protocol for analyzing text that takes you through different steps of looking at patterns in text when you go in with a lens. You have kids focus on a word choice, focus on something when they go back to a text. So we love that protocol because it's so easy to follow. We added onto it in our book, we added the steps of having students think about language. So it's including meta-linguistic awareness in the teaching. So creating space for students to say, what did they think about the language practices that were used there? Or what did they think about the line in that video about language and identity? And then finally, the final step we have there is, what does this mean for us? So us being the classroom or us being the school. So in our school, are we judging people because they are Black and Mexican, or we don't see them as full human beings because of their Blackness? Is there anti-Blackness anti-Blackness in our community? So for us, it was really important to start the book off with that tone and say, we can have these conversations with students. Here's a protocol we can follow to help us develop those ideas.
Oh man, I just think about like the times that we've done, sort of this exercise, specifically like looking at excerpts from books and thinking about like how people's experiences sort of come through the text, right? I mean, in workshops we've shown passages from Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me. We've seen passages about using that same sort of protocol or idea, right? Passages from Brown Girl Dreaming by Jacqueline Woodson to really think about like what has the schooling experience been for authors, even people who are so successful like this, right? And what are some ways that we can change school to have, sort of change that experience, or to turn that experience around, because they talk about these painful memories that they have about schooling, right? And what schooling did to them, unfortunately. And for us, it's really important to kind of think about the ways that this still continues today, right? Schooling can cause harm to children. And so this is one of our focus, like one of our goals, I think, for our work is for us to become that critical educator, or try to nurture the criticality, right? Like Goldie Mohammed does in their work about how to create a space in schooling that is liberating, that is affirming for children. And we hope that we continue to be able to do that.
Yes, Dr. Goldie Mohammed was on the podcast as well, and she talked about her Cultivating Genius book and creating a context for that. And she shared like there's a whole literary community of Black authors. It was like she just wanted to highlight like this is another way of being, another way of seeing it. It's not just literary authors who are white, right? Which was the one I've been trained to see through. And I was like, oh, how lovely. Let's move to chapter 3, which is about telling stories, which you've both talked about earlier with your own children.
So chapter 3, one of the things that has actually been a large part of our work, and I'm actually looking at the recent publication right here, right by my side. It's we did a collaboration with Penguin Random House recently, and chapter 3 really informed that work. It's all about using children's books, YA and middle grade as well. And we came up with this way of using books in a way that creates many opportunities for children to engage with texts. And we call this reading in community. So chapter 3 was really all about how to develop like this sort of way of reading in a way that engages children's language, experiences, etc. Right? And so chapter 3 is about how to use books in a way that really matters.
Would you like to talk about that? How do we boost books in ways that really matter?
Carla, do you want to?
Oh, yeah, sure. So for example, we have one of the books, or we're constantly quoting this book because we love it so much. Isabel Quintero and Zeke Peña in My Papi Has a Motorcycle starts with, Luz, you want to say your favorite line? My papi has a motorcycle.
Yes, let's see. My papi has a motorcycle. From him, I've learned words like carburetor and cariño, drill and dedication. And so that's the first line, right? And so we love that it engages, trans languages, right? It has that word cariño, and we just love to talk about like why did the author, choose to write in this way and what it does for the storytelling. And we take it from there.
So in a typical or traditional approach to, you would grab a book and plan to read aloud. In a reading workshop class, or you're in a character study unit, right? You plan for using these types of books in those very like English teacher literacy focused lessons. So, okay, I'm going to use this to look at how a character relationship between the protagonist and their dad, or the setting and the importance of that community, and the community's changing and how it impacts the child and the father. So I can do that, and that's beautiful. And I love that picture books are used to teach students about characters and character relationships, because that affects our lives, right? So how do I relate to other people? I can use books. Wonderful. In addition to that, we're saying in our reading and community plans is that we want to take that moment for that language awareness. And so even chapter 3 was really the seed for the work that informed our second book together that we did for Penguin Random House, that handbook for these collections of books that we curated for them. And in that handbook, we have language study charts on a bunch of books, kindergarten through 12, that span picture books all through young adult novels. And we plan those reading and community sessions so we can pause and show students what we're thinking about language, and also characters and the plot of the book, but also be intentional about studying language. And so we have a chart for all these books that we feature in the handbook that are Penguin Random House books, where we say, look at this line from the author, it has a word in Spanish. Or we use like Patron Saints of Nothing, one of my favorite young adult novels by Randy Ribai. And it's Tagalog and English in some spaces. And so I love featuring that. And so we have language study charts with that. It's been so fun. We've been doing a lot of reading in the past year before that came out, to make sure we had those language study charts. So chapter 3 in the En Comunidad book was what set us on this path of making sure we created these language study tools for different books that we're using.
I guess what you're saying is like there is an intentionality of when we use text, there's ways so we can make sure that we can hone in on the skills, but also let's add the metacognitive awareness, but the metalinguistic awareness of, oh, this is the way the author is using this word, this is the way the author is using that word. Look at it from different cultures and look how they're bringing it together.
And why, right? Why does this matter? And yes, this matters because of the content and because of we're celebrating bilingualism and multilingualism. But also in chapter 3, we talk about the transition to writing and how these books serve as these examples of, oh, well, Isabel Quintero is doing that. I can do that in my own story too. And so helping students seeing that, and how beautiful is that to say, you do this in your home, you do this with friends, you do this in school, because this is a part of our entire lives. Sorry, I'm in Times Square in New York City. So I'm at a school in Times Square in New York City. These are the sounds of New York City that you hear in the background. I just love that beauty of putting those examples front and center in the classroom, so students can also see, I'm a writer, I'm a bilingual, multilingual writer, I can do this too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's just powerful now that there are books that are translanguaging. I remember in Vietnamese, I was like, oh my goodness, they're writing in Vietnamese. I'm so shocked. When I grew up in America, coming up through public school, and loved my public school, I loved my teachers, but I never saw that kind of representation. So I only saw this hierarchy of language, where English is the only language that's accepted in the community, and everything else is a lesser language, and which communicates lesser value and cultural values. And now that we're shifting towards that, we're really saying, let's make space for all languages. Let's destroy, let's tear down this linguistic hierarchy. And that's why we want to have bilingual students, bilingual families, and bilingual schools. Let's talk about chapter 4, which is about knowing histories and understanding present moment.
I can get us started on that, but yeah, this is a chapter that, I'm thinking about like the ways that, history just informs our experiences, right? And this is sort of what guided this chapter. And Carla, you were the one that picked a lot of the books that we used in that chapter, because of the way that it really celebrated like ancestral knowledge, right? And we wanted to pay tribute to that, right? There's so many writers that are writing about that. I mean, we have Aida Salazar featured, right? We have, I think, David Bowles maybe featured in that book, right? I mean, in that chapter. And it was just really important for us to think about the ways that these authors are bringing this knowledge at the forefront, and the ways that colonization, right, has really, I mean, it's done so much to the cultures, to our languages, to everything. And there's so many ways that people remain, right? That people continue with their indigenous ancestral practices, despite and perhaps in spite, right, of colonization. And we wanted to show the beauty of that.
That was great. Yes. I mean, we use Aida Salazar's The Moon Within. In Spanish is La Luna Dentro de Mí. And really, I wrote the teacher's guide to that book because I was just so impacted by it. And it's given us in our conversations that and in our planning, it's given us this like wake up call and lens to say, what are the texts out there that will help our students learn more about histories that haven't been told?
Yeah.
Whether they haven't heard it from their families because their families were pressured to assimilate, or there's just so much trauma that have gone through generations, or maybe they're in their schools. There's just a lot of texts missing and a lot of perspectives missing. And now we see that in many different spaces around book bans, right? And how books have been banned. There's been censorship of what histories you can teach. So I think we have an immense responsibility as educators to be very intentional with the text that we're choosing and the topics that we're choosing. Not only like what I just shared with Ruth about chapter 3 in our reading and community and helping students as writers and see themselves as bilingual, multilingual writers, but also in our study and understanding of history. So for me, it's been very inspiring with Luz to see these amazing authors, these wonderful bilingual, multilingual authors from populations and language minoritized groups that are raising these stories and they're amplifying these stories. So we said we have to put this in here. We have to talk about them.
Let's talk about your last chapter, which is very close to what you just talked about the political climate of muffling or censoring different narratives in our schools. So how can we be a reader, writer, researcher, and advocate of bilingual Latinx students?
There's so many ways that we can go about this, right? And I think about the work that has to be done still to make our world like more just, more equitable. And I think we all have our role. And for us, I mean, and for me specifically, I think about my role as a teacher educator and how I can nurture like our future like bilingual teaching force or teaching force in general, to launch their career as teachers with this in mind, right? With the positionality that yes, you're going to be their teacher, but you're also going to be like their advocate, right? You're also going to be like so much more. And one thing that we can always do, of course, is be aware of the ways that education can impact our lives, right? It's not just like, and I talked about this earlier, like the harm that can be done to children in institutions, including education, right? Is something that we have to be really well aware of. And how do we create a critically conscious teacher that thinks about the ideas about how we're perhaps imposing and maintaining the status quo through the way that we teach, perhaps, right? And so I think number one, just being aware of like our surroundings, being aware of how policies impact the children that we teach, right? Policies like, I mean, like what Carla already talked about, right? This censorship or the way that this misunderstanding of critical race theory, for example, banning books, like all of these impact our children. And then bigger laws as well, like language policies, whatever educational policies that are very much assessment based or standardized assessment based, like all of these impact our children. So one way that we can do so, become very aware, being able to know who to reach out to within the district or within the school or beyond to get support. I think also social media is a really great way to get your voices heard, especially in this age. I don't know, like, what do you think, Carla? How else can we advocate or become advocates?
I loved coming up with that list of our thought partners that's in chapter 7 at the end of the book. Because as we started saying that this is an ongoing journey, and part of our critical bilingual literacies approach is your self-reflection on language ideologies, we can't do that on our own, right? We don't know it all. We haven't experienced it all. And just like how one of my research studies, teacher, her experience was not the same as the student's experience. As a bilingual person, neither was mine. I came from Chile to the US at age 5. And I was in a school that did not have a bilingual program. And then when I did become a teacher, my first few years, I was in a bilingual program with students from mostly the Caribbean and Mexico, and and like a few from South America. Our experiences were very different. Our varieties of Spanish were very different, and our varieties of English were different. And so we need thought partners. And whether you go to social media or you connect with organizations, whether it's through these podcasts, I think that connection is really important so that we always stay alert and say, I might not know about this particular field or this language or this group of students, but I need to learn. And so let me connect with people.
When I interviewed Dr. Ophelia Garcia, I asked her, what is something that you're really proud of? And she said, I'm so proud to have passed the torch onto my new scholars. And I'm thinking about you, Dr. Espana, and Dr. Yadira Herrera. Thank you for taking the torch up, leading us along the way, and lighting our path. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you for sharing those words. Thank you.